Good afternoon and welcome to the last session of today's annual review of religious freedom. My name is David Kirkham. I'm the academic director at the BYU London Center, and it's been my privilege for the last 9 years to serve as a senior fellow at the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. And it's my privilege now to introduce you to the panelists for this last session that is going to look at political trends regarding religious freedom. Where are we and where are we going on religious freedom issues nationally? We have four well-known, distinguished presenters today, and we're going to hear from them in the order that you have them listed on the program. For those of you who may not have a program, we have, first of all, David Masci, who is senior writer and editor at the Pew Research Center. And then he will be followed by Professor Thomas Berg, the James L. Oberstar Professor of Law and Public Policy at the University of St. Thomas School of Law, followed by Tim Schultz, President of First Amendment Partnership. And then we'll hear from our own BYU's Professor Brett Scharffs, who is the Director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies and also Professor of Law at the BYU Law School. So without taking any more of their time, we'll go ahead now and turn the time over to David. We'll hear four presentations followed by questions and answers at the end for all four.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Because I've got a, okay. Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks particularly to Professor Clark for the invitation to come here and speak to you. And thank you all for hearing what I have to say today. I'm going to talk about religion and politics in the U.S., and I'd like to do that in sort of two different, two halves. One will be a very brief look at the state of religion in America. Are we a religious country? And then look a little bit at how religion influences how we make decisions, particularly political decisions. But before I do that, I want to just, if I can, tell you just for a second about the organization I work for, the Pew Research Center, which is in Washington, D.C. There are about 170 of us who work there. And as I've got up on the screen there, it's an independent, nonpartisan fact tank, which means we don't take positions on any issues. We're not affiliated with any religious group or political movement or party or anything like that. We were created and financed by the Pew Charitable Trusts, and sometimes people confuse the Pew Charitable Trusts with the Pew Research Center. The Pew Charitable Trust is a huge charitable foundation. They do take positions on issues, and so sometimes when you hear somebody saying Pew is pushing for X, Y, or Z, it's them, not us. We don't actually do any of that. We also don't do any research for money. We don't have clients or anything like that. All of our funding comes from the Pew Charitable Trust and some other foundations, and everything that we do is for you. It's actually put out on our website for free. So all of our research is free. Finally, I work for the Religion Project, which is a part of the Pew Research Center. And the Religion Project tries to look at how we order our society, how we make public policy, how we do politics through the lens of religion. That's our focus. And we do that both in the United States, by the way, and around the world. But today we're going to be looking just at the US. Okay. So let me get started with that. The first thing I want to talk about, as I said, is religion in America. Is the United States a religious country? And the answer in short is yes, it is quite religious. In fact, it's kind of an outlier when compared to countries that are like it. So here we ask people, is religion very important in your life? 53% of Americans said yes. That number, by the way, has dropped a little in recent years, okay? But let's compare the US to, say, Canada, where only 29% of Canadians say that. Great Britain, our mother country, 17%. Germany, 21, France, 13. These other Western democratic states that are wealthy are very different than us in the sense that they're just not as religious as we are, at least when people are asked if they're religious, okay? But there are other ways of looking at this as well. When you compare the United States to countries that are in the developing world, that are not as much like it, may not be democratic, may not be as wealthy, say a country like Chile or Brazil, Or go over to Asia and you see India, Turkey, Pakistan. In many cases, the United States is closer to those countries, many of which, by the way, of course, have high levels of religious salience, all right, than it is to the countries that it's most like in most other ways, politically, economically, et cetera, et cetera. So the United States is different than other countries, than the other countries in the world that are most like it. And it's closer, in many ways, to countries that are sort of different in the other ways that we look at societies. Again, politics, economics, and things like that. Whoops. And most Americans say that they believe in God. Look at that. 89% of Americans say they believe in God or a universal spirit. By the way, of that number, about 75% say that they believe in a personal God, a God you can pray to, a God who cares about you. The rest are, you might sort of say, very loosely, deists. That number, by the way, also has dropped recently. So America is religious, but it's a little less religious than it used to be, at least by these measures. And half of Americans go to church or house of worship at least once a month. 36% say they go weekly or more. 14% say they go once or twice a month, okay? A few times a year, about one in 5 Americans will say that, and then 3 in 10 Americans basically only go for weddings and funerals. Again, these numbers have dropped a little in recent years. I'm going to show you a chart in just a second that sort of details that. But still, half of Americans are quote-unquote regular churchgoers, much higher than, again, other countries that are like the US. Here's a general sort of, very sort of broad chart that looks at the breakdown of religious groups in the US. 1 in 4 Americans are evangelical Protestants, 15% mainline Protestants, 21% Catholic. You can see that about close to 7 in 10 Americans still self-identify with some kind of Christianity, okay? Evangelicals largely have held their own in recent years in the sense that they're not shrinking as a percentage of the population. Mainline Protestants are shrinking. Catholics also shrinking. Roman Catholics would have shrunk even more if it were not for Latino immigration into this country, because about 70% of Latino immigrants are Roman Catholics. And about a third of all Catholics now, by the way, are Latino. Mormons, 2%. Jews, just under 2%, but on this chart, 2%. Muslims, Buddhists, about 1%. Islam is growing in this country, by the way, quite rapidly, but there's still only about 3 or 4 million Muslims, mostly immigrants and their children in the United States. This last group I want to talk about is the unaffiliated. If I were giving you this talk 7 years ago, this number would be, I think, 16%. So the number of the unaffiliated has grown very dramatically, even in just the last 7 years. If I were giving you this talk 15 years ago, it would be half the number that you see up there. Why have the unaffiliated, first of all, who are they and why have they grown so quickly? They aren't just people who don't believe in God or are agnostic, let's say, or atheist. Okay, about a third of the unaffiliated say they're atheist or agnostic, so most of them do believe in God. Many of them are spiritual but not religious. I'm sure you've all heard that term before. And a lot of them would even say that they're Christian. They just don't affiliate with a particular church. This number, as I said, has been growing very rapidly, particularly among younger Americans, millennials, adults who are age 35 and younger. They tend to be much more likely to be unaffiliated than baby boomers or age cohorts older than that. So that's a sort of breakdown of a very, very quick breakdown of the US sort of religious pie. And here I told you I was going to show you. You see, evangelical Protestants have lost a little bit of ground in recent years. Catholics, a bit more. Mainline Protestants, even a little more. Non-Christian faiths have grown a little bit, largely because of immigration. Also, immigrants tend to have more children than native-born Americans. So large numbers of people coming, and they're having larger families. And look again, I told you if we were talking about this 7 years ago, the number of unaffiliated in 2007, 16%. Now, or in 2014, the last time we did these polls, 23%. So they've grown dramatically. They're the second, if they were a religious group, they would be the second largest one in the United States. And I mentioned some of the other, excuse me, I just want to mention some of the other ways we measure religiosity Do you pray daily? We talked about is religious important and attending monthly service, but also daily prayer is another good indicator. As you'll see, in all of these cases, the number of people who say yes to any of these things has dropped just a little bit in the last 7 years. So again, that's the sort of, if there's a key takeaway here, it's that the US is still a religious country, but it's becoming a little less religious. And the question is that a trend that'll continue, or is it just something that's happened over, let's say, the last decade, and will either bottom out or change, and Americans will become more religious? And the answer, of course, is we don't really know, but one possible indicator is that the number of people who are driving the drop in religiosity in America are the younger people, are millennials, people who are 35 and under. You can see they're much less likely to say religion is important to them, if I can just use this here, or to pray daily, or to attend religious services, okay? Last year, millennials, for the first time, outnumbered baby boomers as a total percentage of the population. So they're growing, and other age cohorts that are older are starting to shrink because they're dying, all right? So the number of, so if these numbers hold up, if millennials continue to be much less religious than older Americans, chances are the US will become a less religious country in the future. And the question really is then, will millennials become more religious when, say, they get married and have children, right? That's happened sometimes in people's lives. And the answer is we just don't really know yet how, as a group, they're going to respond to changes that happen to them in the future. So we'll have to see. Now I'd like to shift gears and talk about religion and politics. One of the things that we've asked people in the past is it important for the president to have strong religious beliefs? And generally, it's remained sort of even, at about 70%. It went up a little bit in 2008, bumped down a little in 2012. We haven't asked this question for the 2016 race yet, so I unfortunately don't have new numbers for you. But the fact is, most Americans want their president to be a person of faith, okay? You might ask, well, is it a particular faith? And actually, the answer in general is no. Americans are fine with a Catholic president, a Protestant president, an evangelical president, a Jewish president, a Mormon president, in most cases. The one religious group that has a problem, would have a problem if a person from that group were running for president, would be Islam, would be Muslims. About 35 to 40% of Americans say they would, that a Muslim candidate, they would not vote for a Muslim candidate because of their religion. So that's the one religious group. And again, it's at this point anyway, quite a small one in our country that breaks that general rule that any faith is really okay as long as the president is a person of faith. Interestingly, though, while we have those numbers, we have these, which show that over time, the number of people who say that they wouldn't care if the president were an atheist has grown. Look at that, to 41%. And we're not really sure why exactly that's happened. If you want the president to be a person of faith, you would assume that they would believe in God. But at least in some cases, some of the people who said yes to this question, also said yes to this question. So the interesting thing is that we think that because the number of people who would vote for an atheist has grown in recent years, this number, this 67% number, may drop the next time around, the next time we ask. Americans also say that they're fine with their political leaders talking about their faith, okay? Look at that, 4 in 10 Americans say they want more faith talk from their leaders. Over a quarter say that it's the right amount. So you put those two numbers together, you get essentially 2/3 of Americans. A little over a quarter say there's too much faith talk coming out of their political leaders. But still, most Americans say that they're fine and in fact encouraged when their political leaders speak about their faith or talk about faith in general. I don't know what happened. Excuse me for just a second. There we go. And when we break this let me actually break the sorry, I was just thrown off by that. The number of people who, when we start to then look at the election and our voting patterns by faith, we see that the number of people who vote Republican are much more likely to be churchgoers, and the number of people who are Democratic supporters are much more likely to be secular. So when we asked people in the last election, Romney v. Obama, who they voted for and whether and how often they went to church or house of worship, you see that the people who go more than once a week are most likely to be supportive of the Republican candidate. This, by the way, held true for McCain. It held true for Bush. And actually, we weren't doing this poll before George W. Bush and Al Gore ran in 2000. So that's as far back as we go. But in each of the elections since 2000, we've seen the same sort of pattern. People who go to church rarely or never are much more likely to support Democratic candidates. When we break it down by sort of very broad religious groups, evangelicals tend to be great supporters of Republicans, and again, that has held true in every election that we've polled since 2000. White mainline Protestants tend generally to support Republicans, but again, it's not so lopsided. Catholics, quite divided, and they were in previous elections as well. And the unaffiliated, and again, this sort of tracks well with this chart, the unaffiliated are much more likely to support Democrats. Historically black Protestant, people who go to historically black Protestant churches, by the way, are much more likely to support the Democratic president. This is skewed a little bit because Obama got even a higher share of the black vote than most Democrats do. But if this were Bush v. Kerry, let's say, that number would still be over 90%. So it's really not all that different with an African American candidate. So now I'd like to thank you. I'd like to take you to the present. This is some new data that we literally crunched the day I left to come out here, and we quickly made it into a chart. And actually, if you don't mind, those people who tweet and blog and things like that, if you don't mind not tweeting or blogging any of this data out, it actually hasn't been released yet. And so I had to tell the people who generated this data that I would tell you that, so as to reassure them that they would be the people to release it and not you. But it's interesting because look at this. At this point in 2012, in June of 2012, Romney had 73% support among evangelicals. That seems about right, and of course, at the end of the day, Romney got 79%. Trump at this time has even more support among evangelicals, and look at this, people who strongly support Trump higher than people who strongly support Romney. So evangelical Protestants, a huge part of the Republican base is already behind Trump. They've already gotten behind him. The same is true with Clinton if we look at the unaffiliated. Remember I was telling you that they tend to vote Democratic. Oops, did I get that right? Yes. So the unaffiliated, look at this. 68% were ready to vote for Obama at this point in 2012. Virtually the same number are saying that they're going to vote for Clinton, although fewer are strongly committed to Clinton than they were to Obama. So it's kind of interesting because we're in a time, people are saying we live in interesting times right now, right? We're in a time where it seems like a lot of the rules have been thrown away when it comes to our presidential election, all right? I mean, the first woman is running on a major party ticket. That's a pretty big deal right there. On the other hand, until a few days ago, she was under a cloud because she could have been criminally indicted, right? That was just decided a few days ago that she wasn't going to be. And at the same time, we have a person running on the other side who's never held political office before. The last time we had somebody on a major party ticket who hadn't held political office was 1952, and Dwight Eisenhower. But everyone assumed that he had a lot of experience since he'd helped run World War II, all right? And both candidates have very, very low trustworthiness ratings, very low likability ratings. So we're in a very, very different time right now. Well, it's true, they do. I'm not here to comment, by the way, on whether any of them are good or not. It's just a fact, all right? And the point I'm actually trying to make is that even though all of those differences exist, say, when compared to last election or the election before, the same groups are lining up behind the same party, the same choices that their party has made, right? Evangelicals are lining up behind Trump. Unaffiliated secular voters are lining up behind Clinton. So yes, we're living in different times, but some things stay the same. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and thank you to all of you for coming. It's been a great conference. Religious liberty in America is in a troubled state. I think that's the message of this entire conference. In controversies over religious objectors to LGBT rights, progressives and liberals seem increasingly impatient with the very idea of giving weight to religious freedom in the balance. The California colleges bill that Elder Wickman talked about this morning and other disputes suggest that. And he did a masterful job of summarizing those issues this morning, so I won't repeat. But suffice to say that there are a slew of issues, and increasingly there seems very little sympathy on the progressive side for the religious liberty claims of conservative or traditional Christians. Meanwhile, Republicans take up the cause of defending religious freedom, but they have their own problem. Their presumptive nominee proposed until very recently to ban all Muslims from entering the country. And he enjoyed wide support on that, not just from his own particular voters, but from Republican voters overall. 71% of all Republicans in one poll supported the ban on Muslims. And that included Trump supporters, and it was during the primaries. This was a December poll, but also 65% of Ted Cruz supporters and 34% of Democrats. A real difference. There are periodic efforts to block mosques from opening up around the country. Those efforts are driven, when they're driven by local officials, it's mostly by conservative officials. The pattern I'm describing from recent years is that debates over religious liberty have increasingly come to trace and even reinforce and intensify differences over underlying issues such as sexual morality, economic policy, immigration, national security, and so on. Supporters of LGBT rights are increasingly inclined to require objecting religious organizations to facilitate same-sex marriages or act in conflict with their religious beliefs on other issues, whether it's adoption agencies in Massachusetts or colleges in California possibly being disqualified from their students receiving state grants. On the other side, people who harbor strong fears about terrorism in the U.S. or about immigration are increasingly likely to favor discrimination against Muslim individuals and organizations. When any of these efforts on either side trigger religious liberty disputes, the debate simply replicates the debate over the underlying question. This is a problem. Because among other things, religious liberty is supposed to provide a set of accepted ground rules so that people of fundamentally differing views can coexist. Religious liberty is supposed to act as a safety valve to release the pressure of deep disagreement by making space for all persons to express and live consistently with their views. I say express and live consistently with. But if debate over the ground rules does no more than replicate the underlying polarization, then religious liberty will fail in this purpose, and the polarization will worsen. Now, there are differences in these two situations of Muslims and conservative Christians. But I'm going to argue, and that's the burden of my talk, that there are also important commonalities. Let me talk about the asserted differences first. So on the one hand, you could argue that there's a difference in the religious freedom problems that Muslims face because, for the most part, they have not come from government. There are threats of, there's harassment, there are threats of violence, there's discrimination, but we don't see, and some folks on the conservative side would argue this, we don't see the kind of systematic efforts by government to attack religious organizations that you see on the conservative, with respect to conservative Christians. Many national Republican leaders condemned Donald Trump's call for a ban. Government acts against the wrongdoers who vandalize a mosque. But that's not enough. That's not enough of an answer, I don't think, to remove the concern and worry about these issues for Muslims. The ability to worship in practice can be just as threatened by private violence, private harassment, as by government coercion, if that threat of violence is severe enough. In the breakout session, which many of you probably attended, either one, Imam Musri talked about fears that Muslims have of going to the mosque, of wearing headscarves or other religious garb, harassment in schools. LDS people should know that private violence is a religious freedom issue. Right? They got chased across the country by private violence. Catholics should know that private violence is a religious freedom issue. Nativist riots in the 19th century and other events. So I think it's important to see these kinds of threats as a major concern in religious liberty. Now let's turn to the other side, and the answer from liberals on as to religious liberty threats against conservative Christians. Liberals give a couple of answers to say, well, that this threat is not as serious. Why are we liberals emphasizing threats to Muslims and more so than, and not taking account of threats to conservative Christians? Well, for one thing, they would say conservative Christian institutions are harming gay and lesbian students or employees or transgender students and so on. And the laws go after that harm. They go after the act of discrimination. That's different from discriminating against all Muslims, including peaceful Muslims who aren't doing anything. Now, I don't think that's a sufficient answer to dismiss the claims of conservative Christians. The non-discrimination laws clearly can affect religious liberty in very serious ways. And we take it as a given that in some cases, non-discrimination laws must give way in order to protect religious liberty. The Supreme Court said unanimously in 2012 in the Hosanna Tabor case that an individual serving as a minister can be harmed by his or her church and fired. And that is protected by the First Amendment's free exercise clause. There has to be space to take action as a religious organization, even if that action may affect people who have chosen to associate with the church. That's certainly not the only example. Membership criteria, criteria for other employees besides ministers A number of things that Elder Wickman listed this morning, and I think I largely agree with, are crucial to creating space for the religious organization to live according to its values and its tenets. And you can't shut that down by saying you're having an effect on someone else. That's the end of religious liberty, virtually, if you accept that argument. So it's a matter of weighing. It's a matter of weighing where the religious liberty interest and the interests of others. It's not a matter of weighing in each and every case as if we sort of just started thinking about the balance anew in each and every case. We have categories. Ministers are at the core. Religious nonprofit organizations may be a little bit further from the core, but still very important. And the question, though, in constructing those categories is how much weight do we place on religious freedom? So it's not enough to say you're harming someone else and that ends the religious freedom argument. That can't be enough. The second thing that liberals say against conservative Christians is, you're a powerful group. You're not a minority. Right? And so if the legislature doesn't respond to you, that's not showing a refusal to give your situation fair sympathy, because you have the power to be heard, whereas Muslims and other groups don't have the power to be heard. If you lose, it's because your claims just didn't have, just didn't add up. They would have too much of an effect on others. But I don't think that argument is sufficient either. It's way too simplistic, I think, to identify Christian conservatives as simply the majority. Christians are certainly the numerical majority in America, as David reconfirmed. That hasn't changed yet. With all of the stuff that's changed, that hasn't changed. But the differences in perspectives among different Christians are, in many cases, greater than the differences across religious groups. In many cases, the divide in America is between what various analysts have called the progressive and the traditionalist or orthodox views. And that cuts across the various faiths, Catholic, Protestant, and even Jewish. Now, even conservative Christians dominate in some states, like, say, Alabama, where I used to live, but they're a decided minority in liberal states. And that's where the threats to religious liberty come from, as you might expect. And in those places, I think it's fair to say that for large segments of the population, conservative Christians are increasingly becoming regarded as a threat to the social order and the rights of others. So, despite the differences between these two cases, and I think there are real differences. I mean, Muslims are still more of a minority than conservative Christians are. I don't want to overstate the minority status of conservative Christians, even with what I've said here. Even with those differences, though, there are some real commonalities. In both cases, we have faiths that can be, in particular circumstances, and Muslims maybe in most circumstances, unpopular to opponents. Too many of the members of these groups are either Christian bigots or Muslim terrorists. That's the title of my talk. And as a result, they are vulnerable to hostile and burdensome regulation that can impose upon a fundamental feature of their identity. Because of these commonalities, I think it's important for, and I'm speaking to an audience of, I think, mostly traditional Christians, to speak out on behalf of Muslims' religious freedom. For, among other reasons, to have credibility in asserting one's own freedom. Conservative Christians need to follow the examples of people like Robbie George of Princeton, the Becket Fund, and yes, the leaders of the LDS Church. Hostile and jaundiced attitudes towards one large, historic, and diverse faith, namely Islam, can easily set the precedent for turning similar attitudes on another large, historic, and diverse faith. All right, I want to close by just talking about a little bit about just a couple of thoughts on what we need to advocate for religious freedom in this polarized age and advocate for consistent religious freedom. Now, I should say that other folks will be much better at doing this. Tim Schultz, for example, on our panel, this is his job, and other folks who work either in communications or with legislatures. I do that only from time to time, and I do it just enough to be dangerous. But let me offer a couple of suggestions. First, I think religious liberty advocates, in whatever situation they're in, have to make practical arguments about how protecting religious liberty serves the greater good. Now, making those kinds of arguments will not convince the committed activists on the other side who are convinced that you are evil. But making practical arguments has a hope of reaching the people in the middle, who may be unsympathetic to the beliefs themselves, but open to the idea that the persons who hold them bring something of value to the community. One variation on this point is that protecting the religious liberty of members of a group will tend to, I'm going to put this, cement that group's allegiance to the nation, while conversely attacking their religious liberty will alienate them. This argument is especially powerful and I think familiar with respect to Muslim Americans. President Obama recently said in a speech to the Islamic Society of Baltimore, and I quote, "The best way for us to fight terrorism is to deny terrorist organizations legitimacy and show that here in the United States of America we do not suppress Islam. That's how we show the lie that they're trying to propagate." But it's harder to enlist peaceful Muslims if they're being subjected to discrimination and burdensome laws. Now, I think that alienation may, unfortunately, also increase among conservative Christians in the future if the screws turn tighter on their activities, if students at their colleges lose state aid, if the institutions themselves are stripped of their tax exemptions, if they're subject to flat-out government mandates. The alienation will not take the form of violence, likely, but it may take the form of a significant withdrawal from commitment to the nation, a kind of pervasive cynicism about America. When that happens among millions of people, it will accelerate the delegitimation of our institutions, which unfortunately is a process that's already underway, but we don't want to accelerate it. In speaking to Muslims in Baltimore, President Obama said, and I'll quote again, "In our lives, we all have many identities. We are sons and daughters and brothers and sisters. We're classmates, Cub Scout troop members. We're followers of our faith. We're citizens of our country. And today there are voices in this world, probably over the internet, who are constantly claiming that you have to choose between your identities, as a Muslim, for example, or an American. Do not believe them," the president said. "If you're ever wondering whether you fit in here, let me say it as clearly as I can. As President of the United States, you fit in here, right here." This is a really powerful statement and absolutely true. I think it's also true in a way for conservative Christians and their religious institutions, right? Conservative Christians have an identity, an allegiance to a higher power. They also have allegiance to the nation, and the nation that recognizes and respects the allegiance to the higher power and recognizes that you can have both identities is going to claim a much stronger loyalty from those citizens. In the coming years, conservative believers are going to face more and more laws that force them to compromise. and may push them to choose between those identities. There are powerful reasons, I think, for government not to do that. Government, how am I doing here? 2 minutes? Okay. I'll just say the second point really quickly. Religious liberty arguments, to be successful, I think, have to take account of the interests on the other side of the dispute in question. And again, Elder Wickman talked about this a lot in his talk, and I don't have a lot to add there, but let me just say a little bit more about the dynamics, and Tim Schultz can maybe tell me where I'm wrong on this, or maybe not. Respecting the balance between religious freedom and other interests, and being mindful of that, is something that's right in principle, but it's also necessary in practice. And this is where I reiterate what was said this morning. You know, at one time it might have made sense to be aggressive in politics, to push for the broadest colorable protection and enact it in red states, and negotiate from there in more balanced states where there's kind of a political balance. But those dynamics have changed. A law that is perceived with any reason as weighting all on the religious freedom side and not enough on the side of other interests, particularly in the gay rights context, is unsustainable even in most red states now. And the reason there is because of the pressure from national business interests, right? It's no longer possible to not take account of that. So we could talk a little bit more in the question and answer if people have questions about what I think that means, but I would reiterate what was said this morning. It's important for both reasons of principle and reasons of pragmatics to really take account of the interests on the other side and try to draw balances that reflect fairness for all. Thanks.
Thank you for having me, and I just want to tell you first a little bit about our organization, the First Amendment Partnership. We were formed back in 2011 by a collection of faith groups who have diverse theologies but had common interests in seeing that their religious freedom was protected in the foreseeable conflicts that Elder Whitman very capably outlined this morning. There was not at the time an existing organization that was going to work in the legislatures. There is a great organization called the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty that is a great resource for all faiths in the courts, but there really was not an organization working in the legislatures, and there was a thought at the time that's proven to be true that these conflicts would occur in state legislatures, and the reasons are a couple. One is states make a lot of the regulations and laws that might interfere with the free exercise of religion. And also, you know, in case you haven't noticed, Congress is kind of dysfunctional, so they were unlikely to do anything, right? But then also just our system makes state legislatures more efficient vehicles for moving legislation. Things just move more quickly there, and therefore we tend to see things happen in states before they ever bubble up and happen in Washington, D.C. So in this role that I have been in now since 2012, I have been in over 30 state legislatures and have had a front row seat in a lot of these battles, some successes, some failures. And I really want to give you the benefit of knowing in 20 minutes what I know. And so I'm going to do this in three ways. First, I'm going to talk about what has happened, then why it has happened, and then finally what I think will happen. So again, what has happened, why it has happened, and then what will happen. Okay? So first let's talk about what has happened. I'm mostly going to focus on what's happened since 2012, what I'd call the modern era. But I do want to step one step back to 1997, when the Supreme Court decided a case called City of Bernie versus Flores, in which they basically said that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, which Congress had passed in 1993, could not be applied to the actions of state governments. Congress didn't have that power, said the U.S. Supreme Court. So Congress, and this is often forgotten, came back and tried to repass a RFRA law that would satisfy the Supreme Court and also apply to the states. And they actually did do that in the United States House of Representatives, but they were not able to get that done in the U.S. Senate. And they didn't do it because some of the bipartisanship that had been there in '93 had started to break down, particularly over the clash between religious rights and what we might call sexual rights. This is visible as early as the late 1990s. Okay, so this is already kind of present in the late 1990s. Now, as a result, states, if they want to have religious freedom protections in their laws, they had to pass laws themselves to protect the free exercise of religion. Now, 21 states have now passed Religious Freedom Restoration Acts. Of course, those aren't the only kinds of religious freedom protections, but they are a major kind of catch-all broad protection that a lot of people are familiar with. But there's lots of other ways that states protect religious freedom as well. Now, I want to move us into the modern era when I started doing this work, 2012. And between 2012 and 2013, I got to say, religious liberty was kind of cool. It wasn't that controversial, okay? So in 2012 and 2013, 22 states formed religious freedom caucuses in their state legislatures. And about 30% of the members of those caucuses were Democrats. So it was bipartisan, it was kind of cool. And then in 2013, after a 4-year hiatus, both Kansas and Kentucky passed state religious freedom restoration acts with overwhelming bipartisan support. And then in late 2013, when Hawaii called a special session to consider same-sex marriage, the Democratic legislature there, and it's overwhelmingly Democratic in Hawaii, even though they made same-sex marriage the law of Hawaii, they also really bent over backwards, I think, to protect religious freedom. It wasn't as much as I would have liked, but they really took seriously the idea that religious freedom really needed to be protected and these rights were not necessarily a part of a reconcilable conflict. So those are the good old days, and they started to end in 2013. Now, the turning point, I think, is early 2014, where we started to see something different. And I think that looking back, the cause was something that we didn't recognize how important it was at the time. And that was, in 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court decided a case called Windsor that struck down the Federal Defense of Marriage Act. But it signaled that the court was probably on a glide path to, at a 2 or 3 year period of time, declaring a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. And of course, that did happen in 2015. Now, federal courts started striking down marriage laws in states in late 2013. So when states came back in 2014 and started to pass the very same types of laws they had passed the year before, suddenly everybody said, my gosh, this is all about gay rights. This is all about LGBT rights, and this really is about a, quote, right to discriminate or a license to discriminate. And so the whole context of religious freedom in America really came to be defined as a battle between religious freedom and LGBT rights. I'm going to make sure that I'm using this correctly. Could I have you? I'm sorry, I'm not. What do I do? Hit enter? Okay, so Elder Wickman outlined this morning, and I think he's absolutely right. You know, supporters of religious freedom generally have a cluster of rights that they want to protect in this space. They want to protect the rights of, church properties, religious schools, adoption agencies, perhaps some small wedding vendors. But government employees in certain contexts maybe can be accommodated. But what religious freedom supporters are not looking to do, and in fact what they think, and I think is unjust, is represented by the 7-Eleven logo on the side. It's not that we're against 7-Eleven. I use 7-Eleven for the following scenario. imagine a cashier at 7-Eleven has his manager find out that he's gay, and then he fires him for it. Now, that's not religious freedom that we want to protect. Even if he says, this is a religious objection, nobody really is seeking to enact in law an affirmative protection for that kind of activity, okay? In fact, I would, and I think most of the faith groups I work with would just say, we would condemn that as unjust discrimination. However, religious freedom political contests have been a battle to define which one of these we're really talking about, right? So on the one hand, religious freedom supporters have said, we're only after this. But on the other hand, opponents have said, no, you're after this. And of course, since I don't even favor that on the right, if it is successfully defined as a right to discriminate, religious freedom will lose. And, understandably so, because Americans don't favor discrimination in general, okay? So this dynamic has been so evident at play since 2014 that every single session since 2014, Arizona in 2014, Indiana 2015, Georgia and Mississippi 2016, we have had a national clash over religious freedom that has slipped the boundaries of the state and has become a national controversy over the right to discriminate. And by the way, none of those measures has actually become law. Mississippi was the only one to actually enact it into law, and it was enjoined last week by a federal judge. How far we've come, and I think that the best way to say how we've seen an overnight shift here is to say this. When Kansas and Kentucky passed their RFRA laws in 2013, gay rights groups in Kansas were neutral on the Kansas bill, and 67% of Democrats in those states voted in favor of the RFRA laws. Just 1 year later, 6 different state legislatures had votes of some kind on religious freedom restoration acts, and only 9% of Democrats voted for those laws. And 100% of those Democrats were in the state of Arkansas, one of the most Bible Belt states we have. The rest of the 5 states, there were absolutely no Democrats who would vote in favor of these religious freedom laws. And I'm about to tell you why, because now we're going to talk about why this has happened. Okay? So just to summarize, when religious freedom, or religious freedom only, has been paired in a contest with LGBT rights only, religious freedom has generally, in the last 2 years, lost that battle. Okay? Now let's talk about why that's true. First reason is an extension of what David has talked about, which is we have seen a decline in religiosity in the United States. So this is also from David's organization, from Pew. This is looking back. If you just put your focus on the year 1993, and this is among people ages 18 to 40, this is a survey from Pew about how often people attend church weekly or more for people who never attend church or other religious services. You saw that back in 1993, it was about 30% to 16% in 1993. Now you fast forward to today, or at least to 2011, the rise in people in this generation who were age 18 to 40, which we would now call millennials, of people who never attend services has gone way up, and the percentage of people who basically always attend services has gone way down. Now that's a fundamental demographic factor that affects these political battles. The underlying support for religious institutions is shrinking, particularly among younger people. I think David did a great job of outlining that. But also, along with that, the views about matters of sex, homosexuality, sex outside of marriage, divorce, the things that are taught by major religious groups, Catholics, Latter-day Saints, Evangelicals, about these things, are also decreasingly accepted by a majority of Americans. So let's just put it very bluntly. What the Catholic Church teaches about matters of marriage, family, and sexuality makes the Catholic Church a cultural minority in the country that we live in today. And if you're in a political contest and you're a minority, you have to think differently than if you're a, quote, moral majority. You just do. And that's something else that's happened. So among our various parts, influential parts of our population, one of the most pervasively secular parts of American society is the media. That is, people who are reporters or who are producers or who are editors. And the media has covered this issue, and Terry Mattingly was here on one of the breakout panels earlier. He brilliantly talks about this. But the media has tended to cover this issue as an issue of kind of black hats versus white hats. I mean, we're not talking about editorials here. We're talking about hard news stories where the headlines are using the Jim Crow label, or this is a front page above the headline story in the Indianapolis Star a year ago in Indiana. Notice the Mississippi religious freedom law, right? It's not religious freedom law, it's scare quote religious freedom law. How many other political issues get the scare quote treatment? Now look, we frequently talk to editors and reporters and push back against this kind of coverage, and it usually works a little bit. Usually the next story is better, but let's just be honest. Once the Jim Crow thing or the toe tag thing has ricocheted around Facebook a little bit, you know, the issue's been defined, and not in a way that a religious freedom supporter would even recognize. I mean, look, I don't support any of that, right? I work for religious freedom for a living. I don't support it. If that's what religious freedom were, I wouldn't support it. But that also is a cultural headwind facing especially standalone efforts to protect religious freedom. Now, there are also political considerations that have nothing to do with the culture, but have to do with just political strength. Okay? One of those is LGBT groups are very good at politics. They've gotten involved in this issue. They're great at politics. Tim? Okay. LGBT groups are great at politics. I don't say this as criticism. I say this out of jealousy, right? Religious groups who are working in the political arena usually aren't organized like political action committees, nor should they be. And so when the contest is between a kind of very effective LGBT rights movement on the other hand, versus religious supporters who are disconnected and not really formed for political purposes, those contests, which remember are about defining the issue one way or the other, those contests will typically not be won by religious supporters. Again, I'm talking about when religious freedom is offered up as a standalone thing, in the same way that Tom was saying is very hard. And I'm agreeing with him in florid detail here. Okay, this is one thing, but I think by far, the most significant thing that has happened is the weighing in on religious freedom laws by corporate America. Now, this is only a fraction of the Fortune 500. It's not all of the Fortune 500, but it's pretty big, right? I think I've patronized half of these businesses personally in the last week, right? I have my Apple computer right here. I flew out on a Delta flight. I think I bought some Diet Coke at Walmart the other day. You know, I mean, I personally patronize Facebook. I was on Facebook today. I mean, just in the last 36 hours, I've used half of these businesses, and you have too, probably, right? So these are some of the most influential business groups in America, and they are a cornerstone of influence in state legislatures. It's frankly very underappreciated how big and how influential corporate interests are in especially the legislative priorities of state legislatures. It's not about whether these things are voted up or down when they're voted on. It's a question of, you know, when the pressure comes from your political allies, the business community, are you really going to spend the political capital to bring a religious freedom law up for a vote? Or are you really going to sign that religious freedom law if you're governor of Georgia, if all these groups are saying we're going to boycott your state? I mean, it's tough. Not very many people will. That's a huge factor, and you know, unless it's politically accounted for, I think it's religious freedom is going to have a problem. So I have basically summarized why religious freedom, when it's offered up in our present political circumstances as a standalone measure, why it has so many problems. And frankly, for a couple of years, I have been advising faith groups and legislators not to offer up religious freedom only as the solution for dealing with these issues. So what does the future hold, okay? I'm going to briefly predict what the future holds, talk about what will happen, and I could see really three different possible outcomes in states. And I think that all of them are likely to happen in some states. Okay, so the first possible outcome is continued stalemate. Stalemate, that is, religious freedom laws will mostly be offered up and fail. On the other hand, there will probably be efforts to pass LGBT non-discrimination laws at the state level, and they'll mostly fail too. So 28 states do not currently at the state level make it illegal to discriminate against LGBT people. All of these states have at least one legislative body that is controlled by Republicans. And I predict that there won't be any standalone gay rights laws passed statewide if they don't respect religious freedom. In fact, the only state that's passed an LGBT rights law in the last 4 years was the Utah Compromise, which of course really protected religious freedom well, okay? However, I still think that this outcome would be bad for religious freedom because of something that is really underappreciated, and is the pervasive presence of the sexual orientation, gender identity laws, or SOGI laws, at the local level. Okay? So even in our quintessential red state, Texas, pretty much all of the major population centers have one of these laws already, except Houston. They repealed theirs, right? But even in a state as red as Texas, these laws do exist at the local level, and when they happen at the local level, they're typically not written with any balance in mind, okay? And so if you also look at these stats on the left side, most of our American cities have one of these laws now, if they're a city of any size, and that's why 56% of Americans now live under one of these laws. So if we have a stalemate, if we don't pass new laws to protect religious freedom, I think that's not really very good for religious freedom because of the pervasiveness of these local laws, okay? So that's one possible outcome. Outcome number two is, I think, even worse for religious exercise. That would be the judicial redefinition of non-discrimination law. There are cases in the pipeline now making a credible argument that it's already illegal under state law or under federal law to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. They're saying it's already illegal. That is, it's a form of sex discrimination to do this. It's not a total, I mean, it's an argument that's gaining currency in the courts. This is something that's been already adopted by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Of course, just as with the Obergefell case, if this were accepted by the courts, including the Supreme Court, it would eliminate the possibility of the kind of legislative bargaining that we saw in states like Hawaii that did pass laws protecting LGBT rights and marriage, but also firmly protected at least a pretty big swath of religious exercise as well. So I think this would be actually an even worse outcome, and I think, unfortunately, I think faith groups really have to count this cost when they're thinking about what they do, okay? But the final possibility, and I think you're going to see this, I know you're going to see this in more states, and in states, because I think it's the best option going forward, is eventually at the congressional level, is I think you're going to see more Utah compromises. It's interesting to note that originally it was an attempt to, before Utah tried this, it was Michigan. It was the Michigan attempt at the Michigan compromise. They just didn't get there, so it's called the Utah compromise because Michigan didn't get there. But it was a Republican Catholic Speaker of the House who introduced the first attempt to sort of fuse together the idea of fairness for all, and didn't quite get over the hump. But it's pretty interesting because he so lowered the temperature in Michigan over these issues that about 6 months later, Michigan did pass a standalone protection for religious adoption agencies that was signed into law by a very moderate governor without big national outcry. And he didn't do that cynically. I just think he had so lowered the temperature on the issue in the state that you didn't start off with a massive culture war the moment you talked about religious freedom. And I think that's the right, it's right morally, of course, but I think it's also, frankly, where the politics match up with the morality. But just another great example. Everybody remembers that the Indiana RFRA law was a big national controversy. This year, some more conservative Indiana legislators introduced a version of the Utah Compromise in Indiana. And the very same business groups that last year had testified hard against the RFRA law were testifying in favor of religious freedom protections alongside LGBT rights, religious freedom protections that went way beyond the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and, frankly, went way beyond the Utah Compromise in protecting religious freedom. These are the corporate interests that everybody thinks are so bad and horrible and mean to religious freedom. But frankly, it's not that they're absolutely opposed to religious freedom. It's just that corporate interests are going to weigh in on the other side if, as Tom said, these measures are not balanced. That's just a political reality in the world we live in. So, in closing, I want to come back to my original slide. I really think that if supporters of religious freedom want all the things on the left, I think they're going to have to be willing to not just say to condemn the discrimination on the right, they're going to have to be willing to make it illegal. And I think also that if supporters of LGBT rights want to make the discrimination on the right illegal, it's not going to be enough to just condemn the closing of religious adoption agencies, right? They're going to have to protect religious exercise. That is, both sides are going to have to realize that they really, to get what they want, they're going to have to come together and seek compromise. So this is why I'm fundamentally optimistic, because I think this is the trajectory of this. And I just say in closing, what I do as a kind of political actor protecting religious freedom in legislatures is not the core mission, in my opinion, of religious institutions. I think their core mission is to go out and to serve the community, and to do so without fear that they're going to be in constant legal threat. So this whole project of religious freedom is in service, I think, of a much more important mission, and that is to remake the culture, to serve the public. And I think that I'm very optimistic. I know from working with so many faith groups that the idea that that is the real mission, the compromise allows them to get to that real mission. I am very optimistic that that's where we're going to ultimately end up, albeit with some struggles along the way. Thank you very much.
Well, let me thank all of my co-panelists for their interesting and informative presentations. And let me thank you for still being here at nearly 5 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. One of the most alarming developments over the past decade in our social and political life in America is the divide that has developed between defenders of religious freedom and defenders of gay rights. Today, many on the political left treat religious freedom as if it is nothing more than a pretext for the right to discriminate against LGBTQ individuals. Meanwhile, many on the political right treat gay rights as an existential threat to religion and religious freedom. This is a development that is worrisome, both for those who care deeply about freedom of religion and for those who care deeply about non-discrimination against people on account of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Not to mention those of us who believe both are important social, political, and legal values. Both religion and sexuality touch on our deep and deeply personal identities as human beings. Both religion and sexuality have resulted in people being targeted for discrimination, hostility, social ostracism, persecution, and even genocide. It is no accident that Nazi Germany targeted both Jews and Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as homosexuals, for extermination. I believe it is imperative that we seek to find ways to help the middle hold, that people of goodwill who care deeply about each and both of these values find ways to seek compromise when necessary and cooperation and common ground when possible. For defenders of religious freedom, and I say this advisedly, there is nothing that could be more inimical to our cause than to be in an actual or perceived zero-sum game conflict with defenders of LGBT rights. I am thinking of recent conflicts that have arisen in places like Arizona and Indiana over state religious freedom restoration acts, as well as the transgender bathroom controversy in North Carolina. I am thinking of the social upheavals that have accompanied the Supreme Court's declaration last year that the Constitution requires all states to recognize same-sex marriage. I'm also thinking of the controversies that have arisen regarding small business, typically florists, bakers, and photographers who have faced civil and criminal liability for their decision to not provide services for gay weddings. I'm thinking of people, both religious and LGBT, who have lost or been denied jobs based on their religious viewpoints or advocacy of gay rights. We need strategies that will lower rather than raise the temperature and volume surrounding these controversies. We cannot expect the fires to be put out by people whose tools are matches and gasoline. We cannot allow the debate to be dominated by those whose primary tools are the bullhorn, formats that require us to express our ideas in 140 characters or less, or the comment section in online publications. Fortunately, in America, we have a lot of experience dealing with similar challenges. Today, I would like to discuss some of the lessons we can learn from our history, of facing such difficulties. I do want to make a couple of notes. First, I'm going to speak today quite personally, perhaps more personally than is typical in an academic setting. I'm going to speak as a person of faith, as a Latter-day Saint, but also as a law professor. I'm going to speak to an audience that is predominantly, although not exclusively, Mormon. And I'm going to speak as someone who cares deeply and loves family members who are gay. Before talking about the lessons that we may learn, I'd like to begin by making two observations. These have been touched upon already. First, religious freedom is controversial today in a way that it was not 20 years ago, or as Tim explains, even 3 years ago. There is something really remarkable about the story he just told about the treatment of state RFRAs in 2013 versus 2014. This is a stunning and dramatic political turn of events, and there is no other possible explanation for it than the politicization of religious freedom in contest with LGBTQ rights. And so that is the nub of the politicization of religious freedom. And unless we address this issue, we are not going to decrease the temperature and decrease the volume with respect to religious freedom. There's a complex story to be told here. It's a story about the Employment Division versus Smith case, the congressional reaction in RFRA, the court's counter-reaction in Bernie, the counter-reaction in Congress with Arlupa and the state RFRAs. But I'm going to skip all of that and simply note that with the advent of the controversies in Arizona and Indiana, there was a sharp change. When the Arizona law was being proposed, you'll recall it was right before the Super Bowl was to be played. And there were headlines which blared that this was a law designed to permit discrimination against gay Americans, to deny services or employment to them. Some commentators describe the bill as draconian, as a license to discriminate, as a Christian shield. One article claimed that the bill would turn Arizona into the next Uganda. And so the political pressure that was brought to bear, largely by businesses, including the NFL, became intolerable. And Jan Brewer, the Republican governor, vetoed the bill. Something very similar played out in Indiana. You'll recall it was similarly about a week before the NCAA Final Four was going to be played in Indiana. And a very similar template played itself out in the Indiana situation. Well, what can we learn from these scripts? One is that religious conservatives can be faulted for looking to RFRAs as a mechanism for shielding them from non-discrimination laws, which was not what the statutes were designed to do. Equally problematic is the mischaracterization of RFRAs by supporters of gay rights. Many have taken an absolutist response into the battle, characterizing the RFRAs and religious freedom as a whole simply as tools used by the religious right to discriminate against the LGBT community. This is untrue. The concern about religious freedom, the concern for RFRAs, dates back to Employment Division versus Smith and the striking down of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act by the Supreme Court in the Bernie case. And the coalitions that existed at those times in favor of religious freedom were broad and included liberal as well as conservative groups. RFRA passed the House unanimously. In the Senate, there were 3 dissenting votes. Bill Clinton signed the bill to great fanfare. I was going to read his signing statement to you, but time doesn't allow. It's not quite as eloquent as George Washington's departing message at the end of his service as president, but it struck the very, very same themes. So that's observation number 1. Religious freedom is politicized today in a way that it has not been until very recently. Second observation. We live in a political environment where everyone, or perhaps nearly everyone, feels threatened and fearful, and often those fears are warranted. Consider the journey we've traveled in the last year, from the mass shooting in Charleston just a year ago targeting black Christians, to the Orlando nightclub shooting just a few weeks ago targeting gay Americans. Every community throughout the United States seems to feel threatened in one form or another. Muslims by Islamophobia, immigrants by all forms and types of xenophobia, Christians by losing their religious freedom in the wake of LGBT rights, Jews from anti-Semitism, African Americans by pervasive racism by the white majority and by police conduct in particular, and the LGBT community from the religious right and discrimination. Surely this list could be added upon. It seems that almost every group in the country has a sense of fear of what the future may hold. One recent poll seemed to capture this anxiety we feel as Americans about the future. When asked whether the country's best days are ahead, public opinion was evenly divided, with 49% saying the country's best days are past and 49% saying they lay in the future, with 2% having no opinion. This is a dramatic change from even 3 years earlier in 2012, still in the grip of the recession of 2009, when 54% of Americans said the best days were still ahead, and only 38% said the best days have come and gone. So, this is the question I'd like to focus on. Can we get beyond the perception of religious freedom and gay rights being locked in a zero-sum game, where a victory for one of these values is viewed as a defeat for the other and vice versa? As someone who cares deeply about religious freedom, but as one who also cares deeply about principles of non-discrimination and tolerance of others, even those with whom we might disagree, and I think most of us, believe that finding strategies for achieving not just compromise, but also avenues of cooperation and areas of common ground between religious freedom and gay rights is of paramount importance. Fortunately, we are not without resources for finding constructive strategies. As Americans, we have a long history of finding ways of transcending differences and of strengthening our civic commitments to a tolerant and inclusive society. We have learned a lot about how to accommodate matters of conscience with our other important values, such as non-discrimination. What are some of the lessons that we've learned? One place we can turn for helpful lessons is the history over the struggle in America over civil rights for African Americans. When the Civil Rights Act was adopted in 1964, Title VII prohibited discrimination in employment on the basis of race and religion, as well as sex. This was a major accomplishment. Opposition to a law prohibiting discrimination in employment had been opposed by powerful forces in both parties for generations. Title VII, however, addressed the issue of coverage for small businesses. Title VII did not apply to businesses with fewer than 15 employees. This is not because Congress approved of discrimination by small businesses or wanted to encourage discrimination. There were several reasons for this exemption. One was allocation of resources. With widespread discrimination against Black Americans, there were bigger fish to fry than the small business who discriminated against people on the basis of race, religion, or gender. In addition, there was a recognition that small businesses are often identified with affinity groups. A hair salon might cater to African Americans, and the employees might predictably be Black. Or a small family business might be comprised of people of the same race or the same religion. The important point is that even when it comes to protecting against discrimination on the basis of race, religion, and sex, we have made reasonable accommodations for small businesses. If we were to extend the protections of non-discrimination laws to include prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, similar reasonable accommodations and carve-outs, I think, would seem to be appropriate. Imagine how much of the debate surrounding small businesses, such as photographers, bakers, and florists, could be resolved by adopting laws that protect LGBTQ people from employment discrimination, but that also included a carve-out for small businesses. There is something else important that we should learn from the race analogy. The fight for gay rights has been largely fought on the back of the race analogy. Sexual orientation, we were told, is an immutable characteristic, just like race. And so, to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation was just like and just as bad as discriminating on the basis of race. This was always an overbroad claim, but those who dissented were pushed to the margins. Today, with the battle for gay rights largely won, it is little surprise that a new conventional wisdom is emerging, one where sexual fluidity is the catchword, and where sexual orientation is viewed much more as a spectrum than as bifurcated categories. The recent extension of gay rights into the sphere of transgender rights, however, has turned this immutable characteristic argument upside down. Conventional wisdom, progressive conventional wisdom, now insists that gender identity is a matter of self-expression, choice, and authenticity. It is not surprising that those who do not simply flow with the tide of ever-changing conventional wisdoms experience something of whiplash. Yesterday being deemed backwards bigots for not seeing sexuality as an immutable characteristic, and today being deemed backwards bigots for thinking that gender is an immutable characteristic. Meanwhile, those who pound the drum loudly in favor of the new conventional wisdom hardly notice the tension, or perhaps even inconsistency, between these two conventional truths. We can also, I think, learn from how we regard services that are expressive or creative. We tend to think differently about how non-discrimination norms apply to artistic or other expressive endeavors. For example, we would not accuse an artist of discrimination when he or she lends their creative energy to one viewpoint or another, even on controversial issues. This is true even of commercial artists. We would be shocked if a commercial artist were required to accept business on behalf of a cause in which he doesn't believe. For example, a freelance writer that helps companies with press releases would not be forced to accept an engagement from a company that wanted help with publicity designed to refute climate science. Attorneys are given wide latitude in accepting or rejecting clients based in part on whether the lawyer views himself or herself as personally suited to representing a particular point of view. It should be possible to create careful and narrow carve-outs to protect conscience for businesses that have strong expressive or creative elements, including photographers, florists, and bakers. Imagine a client that walked into a bakery with gay owners with a request that a cake be decorated with an anti-gay rights message. We would not be scandalized if the baker turned down the job, and the legal apparatus of the state would not be marshaled to punish the bakery for turning down that job. This is not just a hypothetical, this has happened. If a Mormon wanted a cake for a baptism that celebrated entering the one and only gate to salvation and eternal life, we would not be scandalized if an atheist baker declined to make the cake. We might hope the baker would be polite. I'm not the right person for this job, but let me recommend someone who would do a good job for you. But in any event, such a baker would not be found liable in civil or criminal law for religious discrimination. The reason for this is that the discrimination is not based on the identity of the individual, which is often a protected class, but on what the action requested represents, participating in expressive speech, which is not protected. We can also learn from legislative accommodations of religion in same-sex marriage legislation. In states where same-sex marriage was recognized by legislatures or through referenda, there were common-sense protections for religious freedom. Even in states such as Hawaii, we saw this the case. I have a description of these in my paper. New York, New Hampshire, many states have found ways to do this. We can also, I think, learn from our understanding of religious freedom. As we come to understand the appropriate legal boundaries for policing discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, we can perhaps take a page from what we have learned about living with religious difference and the meaning of non-discrimination with respect to religion. The right to not suffer discrimination on the basis of religion does not include a right for me to demand that everyone be required to accept my religion as true, or even deserving of respect. Tolerance we can expect under law. Respect generally must be earned. To be tolerated as a Mormon does not mean I can expect everyone to accept my conviction that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, or that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the one true and living church. No one wants to be discriminated against on the basis of our religion, although most Mormons would have little difficulty recounting experiences of discrimination or mistreatment they have experienced on account of their religion. Too often, proponents of gay rights seem to demand complete acceptance and endorsement of their choices and behavior. As a matter of law, this is too much to ask. Toleration of a Mormon conception of marriage does not require others to agree that an ideal marriage is for time and all eternity. And toleration of same-sex marriage should not require that this form of marriage is viewed by everyone as equivalent in every way with traditional understandings of marriage. A helpful distinction in this regard is to differentiate between civil marriage on the one hand and holy matrimony on the other, or to use Mormon terminology, between civil marriage and a temple sealing. We can expect to have our civil and political rights respected without demanding that the deeper normative dimensions of our conception of marriage be accepted by others. I think we can also learn something from religion's support of gay rights. When the history of gay rights is written, one of the key turning points will likely be seen when the gay rights movement stopped thinking of religion as always and everywhere the enemy, to realizing that it could be a powerful ally. I have a long explanation of religious groups very early on: Unitarian Universalists, United Church of Christ, the Episcopal Church, the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, who long before there was a constitutional right to same-sex marriage, recognized same-sex marriage under their religious law. The point is that when public policy stipulated that marriage was defined as a male-female relationship, progressive religious dissenters were allowed to dissent without fear of being persecuted or losing their tax-exempt status. Now that public policy has stipulated that marriage includes same-sex marriage, religious dissenters, now the traditionalists, should likewise be allowed to dissent without fear of being persecuted or losing their tax-exempt status. We can also learn from other examples of conscientious objection and conscientious dissent. There are several contexts in which this takes place. One is conscientious objection to military service. We have learned that it's possible to accommodate conscientious dissenters without national security collapsing. We have similarly learned that we can create exceptions for conscientious objectors, to those who don't want to pledge allegiance to the flag, to give them an exemption without our sense of patriotism collapsing. And even with a social issue as sensitive as abortion, we have for the most part found ways to protect doctors, nurses, and pharmacists who object to being involved in what they consider a moral evil. If we can find ways to accommodate conscience in all of these and many other areas, it seems like we ought to be able to find ways to protect conscience in the area of religious freedom as well. We can also learn from our experiences with compromise. We've heard a little bit about the Utah Compromise, which protected gay citizens from discrimination in employment and in housing, and also protected religious people from being forced to violate their religious conscience. When those things were done in tandem, compromise was possible. The Mississippi law that was just struck down tried to do just one, and it was struck down on 2 or 3 different constitutional grounds. Thanks, David. Last year, speaking from this very podium, Governor Herbert described his experience working on the Utah Compromise. He had taken a fair amount of criticism from conservative critics who opposed compromise with gay rights groups. At the time, Governor Herbert described his political motto in a way I found very memorable. He said, "I am conservative in principle, strive to be moderate in tone, and inclusive in process." I have not always been a strong supporter of Governor Herbert, but I think there is something that we can all learn from this fundamentally good and decent man. Other prominent politicians have recognized that compromise does not exhibit weakness. President Obama has noted, quote, "No party has a monopoly on wisdom. No democracy works without compromise." John F. Kennedy, in his inaugural address, said, "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." Let me mention just one or two other possible lessons. One is, I think we can learn from our histories of discrimination. Both Mormons and the LGBTQ community share histories of painful persecution. Mormons were driven from state to state by violent mobs and biased politicians. LGBTQ communities can express a similar sense of individual and political discrimination. In some ways, it seems we have not learned from these histories. People on both sides are still persecuted for their beliefs and opinions. But other individuals do seem to have learned a valuable lesson. Consider the example of Chris Singleton, whose mother was killed in the AME church massacre just a year ago. He was a teenage son of Sharonda Coleman Singleton, one of the 9 people killed in Charleston. Perhaps you remember him standing in the middle of a baseball field with a microphone and a coach standing at his side, pleading for calm. This was in the shadow of Ferguson, Baltimore, New York City, where there had been race riots. This is what he said: "Love is always stronger than hate. If we just love the way my mom would, the hate won't be anywhere close to what love is." We can also learn from the tendency of the abused to become abusers. This is a common story in history. Christians were persecuted, and in the 4th century, within a generation, went from being killed to killing others based upon their religious beliefs. Social science teaches that this is very similar with abusers and bullies. Most abusers were once abused, and most bullies have been bullied. Religious communities, like LGBTQ communities, can transform or be transformed remarkably quickly from those who have been bullied into bullies themselves. Well, I'm out of time, but let me just conclude with 2 closing comments. One is, I think we should be careful about not crying wolf. When the North Carolina bathroom bill was described as a religious freedom bill, the hair on my neck stood up. This was partly a characterization of opponents, because it was deemed politically advisable to turn this into a fight against religious freedom for political reasons. But it didn't have anything to do with religious freedom. Now, clearly there are cultural valences that track religious identifications, but if we're going to call everything a religious freedom issue, then as Elder Wickman told us this morning, we need to be prepared for everything to be considered unimportant rather than everything being considered important. Finally, I think we need to become more adept than we are at learning not to equate disagreement with hatred. Because of the history of discrimination against homosexuals, it is easy to understand how any opposition to same-sex marriage can be equated with animus. But that simply isn't the case. It is not true that any opposition to same-sex marriage is ipso facto animosity towards gays. This is unhelpful and inaccurate. Concern for the health of marriage as a social institution was an important topic long before gay marriage was taken seriously. And there are intelligible and reasonable bases for supporting traditional marriage, and caring, compassionate people can oppose same-sex marriage without hating homosexuals. So in conclusion, we're in an important moment where there's tremendous tension between gay rights on the one hand and religious freedom on the other hand. But we've been through these types of challenges before, and what we've had is lessons learned of how we can vindicate two values at once. It doesn't always have to be a trade-off. Sometimes there can be compromises, but sometimes there can be mutual vindication of important values. My hope is that us, as individuals and collectively, we can move forward in ways that will strive to heal and calm rather than inflame and enrage. Thank you.
We now have about 20 minutes for questions. We're going to have at least one roving mic. We need to keep one of the mics here at the table. You got two roving mics? Okay, all right. And so I'll sort of stand here for now and receive questions. The very, very back, white shirt. Mic is on its way.
I know that there are individuals, possibly in the room and outside of the room, who take issue with the manner in which gay rights have been recognized by the court, particularly through the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause. But accepting for the sake of my question that this is the law of the land, that the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause protect what the court says they protect. When a right like gay marriage butts up against freedom of religion, free exercise, is there a mechanism, an analysis for deciding, and I guess I'm creating a false conflict here, but assuming that they are diametrically opposed to each other in a case, is there an analysis or a mechanism for deciding which of those rights wins? And if so, what is it?
So, volunteers to take the question.
Well, there are factors to consider and categories to use. One is the sort of proximity of the situation to the core of religious exercise and activity. And this is, I think, again, repeating what was said this morning, right? That the Supreme Court would unanimously say that a church can refuse to ordain a practicing gay person if it deems that it should. Every justice on the court would say that it'd be a slam dunk. In the commercial sphere, on the other hand, you're further from the core of religion. Now, there are some problems with talking about the core versus the periphery. It can be dismissive of the if you do that too easily, it can be dismissive of the idea that religion is a pervasive part of one's life. So it doesn't mean that there should be no accommodation in the commercial sphere. It just means that it needs to be sort of cabined much more. So I think that's one category, and the religious nonprofits are going to be where the big fights are going to be for years, because the different situations, there are endless situations about religious nonprofits that are somewhere in between the church and the commercial situation. I think the other factor is that you would like to argue could be considered under religious freedom laws is what are the alternatives for the same-sex couple? Right? If there is another adoption agency or 12 other adoption agencies ready and happy to put a child in a loving same-sex couple's home, then we can accommodate religion in that case without burdening in any sort of practical way the ability of people of same-sex couples to adopt. I think there are probably other factors that you can use, but I think those are two of the most important ones.
Anyone else on that one? Other questions? Yeah, okay, sort of in the middle, standing by the person with the mic. Yep.
Yeah, my question I think was for David regarding the research that you were quoting. I was curious, in the climate that we're in, it's becoming more and more politically charged, and people's willingness to share their opinions is becoming less and less. And I was curious about how you are working to combat that in terms of the way that you sample and in achieving response rates that represent the populations across the board, whether it's by, I know some are going to internet sampling, which then kind of reflects millennials a bit more, I think, in certain things. And so I was just curious about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that, but let me start by saying I don't actually do the sampling. We have data scientists who do that, but yeah. So a couple of things. One is that we're constantly switching up the mix of landlines, mobile phones, and internet sampling that we do. So sometimes we do all three when we do a poll, because we're trying to reach, as you pointed out in your question, different populations. So that's one thing that we do. Also, it's important for people to understand that response rates are very, very low. I mean, if we get 20% of the people we reach out to respond, that's considered a great success. So most people don't want to talk to us, and they don't want to talk to other pollsters either. A part of it is just time, because these things sometimes take 25 or 30 minutes to complete. The other thing that we do is we oversample quite a bit. So we often do a greater sample size than we think we need. And so the idea there is that we want to make sure that we reach, different populations, that we adequately reach people in various geographic areas. So we're very, very careful about that too. And of course, we're constantly sifting through the census data and other data to make sure that the samples that we ultimately do use are very representative of the country as a whole. So it's very difficult, and we actually, about a year and a half ago, created something we called Pew Labs, which is a group of people, that's all they do, is look into how to best, what sort of methodological improvements we can make to improve the quality of these polls. And I'll just say one other quick thing, which is most of you probably, and there's no reason you should, have ever listened to a poll being a poll questioner reaching out to and conducting a poll with a person. And if you did, you might think less of the data that you saw today. A lot of people are very distracted when they answer these questions, and so there are often kids running around the house. There are other things that are other issues that are coming into their world, just as our poll questioner is trying to get them through the poll. And also sometimes people aren't listening, or they don't understand, but they're not willing to admit that they don't understand a question, and so they answer it anyway. So there are all kinds of issues, and the best way to deal with those, again, is to oversample, because after a while, we ultimately get this. We can iron out some of the problems when we have a larger sample size. So.
Great, thank you. Right here, please. You got a microphone down here, please?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, let me decide, and I'm going to have you get your exercise running up and back down. So, yeah.
I'm not going to give up this microphone.
I won't force it. This is all about freedom, right? So.
I'd like to address my question to Tim. Professor Scharff, is talked about the possibility for compromise in public accommodations as applied to wedding vendors. It's my understanding that that wasn't addressed in the Utah Compromise. Have you seen that in any other state legislatures? And if not, what conditions do you think are necessary to kind of bring that about?
So that's a really good question. A lot of people don't realize Utah did not have an existing public accommodation statute, so there wasn't as much pressure. I mean, I think that there was a good faith effort to address it privately, but there wasn't as much pressure because there wasn't an existing public accommodations law. In other states, you're inheriting a public accommodations law, and LGBT rights groups quite reasonably say we want to be included in those protections as well. So really, how do we strike those balances? There have been various attempts to do it. They did it. They try to do it in Indiana this year. They're trying to do it in Ohio, a couple other states, Idaho. I will say this is by far, when you get into a room and practically figure out how to do this, one of the hardest things to deal with, because it's kind of like with the even with the over-the-counter service for wedding clerks, people who work in a government office. There is a real kind of insult factor when somebody shows up to get married and a government worker turns them away. So one of the things Utah did is they said, look, if you're a government worker and you want to step off from having to perform or be directly involved in a same-sex union, that kind of has to happen behind the curtain. It has to happen before the service is denied to somebody at the counter. And the problem is that it's hard to figure out a way to do that in the context of a public accommodation or a wedding vendor. So there are ways to do it that make a lot of sense legally that are kind of hard politically, and I think the ways that are easier politically are kind of the law professors don't like very much. So I mean it's kind of a windy answer to say it's really hard, and you sort of a lot of times end up with the idea that, well, let's try really hard, but then people sometimes end up with saying, yeah, maybe we should just leave public accommodations out of this. So that's where a lot of people end up landing after they've really worked through in good faith all the actual available options.
In the states that were passing same-sex marriage recognition before the Supreme Court decision, there were, as Brett was saying and Tim was saying, there were protections for religious organizations and nonprofits. Not one of those states gave any shrift really to considering the wedding vendors. It's a really hard climb on that.
Thank you. Now to the gentleman with the microphone, but I'll keep you down here, okay? So, yeah, thanks.
Okay. Well, this is a sticky issue because, we're supposed to be tolerant of them, but they sure not tolerant of us. They want us to avoid discrimination, but what does discrimination mean? To discriminate means to make a choice. So every time that they pass a law against discrimination, somebody suffers. And that's the basis of Americanism, is to be able to make a choice, freedom. Like the case up in Oregon where the two bakers up there, a lady and a man and a woman, operated a bakery, and the lesbian couple came in, wanted to bake, and the baker said, well, no, we don't want to, and they were fined $135,000. Well, now, they want us to be reasonable with them, but they're sure not reasonable with us. And the problem is that the LGBT crowd has teamed up with the secular humanists and the Marxists to achieve their political goals. They are not our friends, and they're not reasonable with us, and when they want us to be reasonable with them means they want us to yield to their demands. So it's a
So is there an
no
actual
harm.
question? What's the actual question? So we're gonna.
Yes, would you please tell how we can accommodate them in their anti-discrimination laws without giving up our freedoms? Thank you.
And might I just say that even though we're pretty much, I don't know, a homogenous group here, the them and the us might be different in different people's minds here, so. Go ahead.
So I would just say, respectfully, I would say I don't agree with the questioner, with your characterization of the entire situation. I say that respectfully. But having said that, I think that sure there's a spectrum. I mean, I think that there are. And so in the questioner is right in this respect, that there are elements of the LGBT community that absolutely would love to shut down religious adoption agencies. Sure, there are probably some people who think that way. I don't think that that's the majority view. And I think that there are probably also elements of evangelical Christians who would be just happy to see people who are gay suffer because they feel like they deserve it. I don't think that characterizes the mainstream of religious Americans, but I think that you'll find that. So I think that the key is to try to find the people who are reasonable, not the people at the extremes. And I think once the extreme options have been tried, I think that they will generally fail. And I think that makes people more rational and more likely to try to find compromise. But I do agree that there are extremists on both sides, but I don't think either side is particularly characterized by extremism. If you just look at how these things are treated online, you might have a different view, because online discourse tends to be extremely polarized. And, I have lots of people who I have to mute on Facebook because I think, my gosh, I like that person so much in person, but their Facebook persona really bugs me, right? So, I mean, these are people that are great, that I like. So I do agree that if you just look at how this discourse is used online, it does seem like the Hatfields and the McCoys. But I think that if you really deal with people on a personal basis, and that's part of the problem. We're dealing with people in their online format rather than the personal basis. But I think if you deal with people on a personal basis here, you'll find that there's a lot of common ground. And I've just seen it in so many state legislatures that's why I'm sorry to say I respectfully disagree with you.
The online debate too often takes place between people who don't have enough to do, right, in their lives. So, okay, so we have a question right here. We've got about 4 more minutes.
Thanks. It's been over a year now since I've read the Utah Compromise, and I admit to finding it confusing. The last speaker said that it protects both LGBT rights as well as individual rights, and I didn't get that from the bill. I saw a lot of protections for churches, Boy Scouts, other institutions, but can you explain to me where are the individual protections?
So Utah protected individual rights in a couple of very important ways. First, a speech protection in the workplace. Utah was the first state that said you cannot be punished by your workplace for your speech, whether outside of the workplace or inside the workplace, on issues related to marriage, family, and sexuality. So the Brendan Ike situation with Mozilla, which is a high-profile case, those kinds of things happen in the lesser-known situations all the time. And Utah, with some reasonable, provisions for employers too, they have to be able to police workplace speech. But that's a huge area of risk for, I think, people on both sides that Utah addressed. That's an individual protection. Utah addressed the clerks issue in a way that only one other state has done, and protected clerks. That's an individual protection for government workers. They also protected the rights of people in the light and professional licensure, which also was an area which hasn't really hit yet, but I think is going to. So that's an individual protection that really flows to individuals. And then lastly, I would say that I do think that the distinction between protecting institutions and protecting individuals is a little bit of a false one, and here's why. If you protect a religious institution like BYU, you protect all the people associated with that institution. Right? If you're part of an institution that loses its accreditation, there's a lot of individuals that are there now or there in the future or there who have degrees from there that suffer greatly. So I think that protecting religious institutions shouldn't be seen as not protecting individuals. I think it protects a lot of individuals just as part of a group. But I think that the Utah Compromise, in fact, protected more individual rights in this space, in the religious freedom space, than any other state law has done. But I think, I think it's important to protect individuals and institutions.
I think that's actually about the end of the time that we have, and I'd like to ask you to thank the speakers one more time.